May I speak in the name of our loving, liberating, and life-giving God. Amen. Please be seated. At the end of my first semester of seminary, all of the Episcopalians preparing for ordination in my class were asked by our dean to write an essay titled, "This I Believe," which we would read aloud to one another as part of our final colloquium. The prompt was actually borrowed from NPR. Compose a brief piece about a personal belief that is near and dear to your heart. Our dean was very clear that this was not a theological exercise. He did not want to listen to 15 re-articulations of the Nicene Creed. When the day finally came, he kicked things off by reading one of his favorite essays from an old collection called "I Believe in Going to the Funeral." I remember one hilarious piece from a classmate titled, "I Believe in Singing in the Car," and another surprisingly moving one, "I Believe in Tipping the Pizza Guy." When my turn came, I read my title aloud. I believe in telling the truth. To be honest, since that's at the center of today's sermon, telling the truth did not always come easily to me. As a child, I looked around and saw a lot of people giving lip service to honesty, but very few people actually practicing it. Politicians, celebrities, business people, even the adults in my community, most seemed far more concerned with seeming right or with what other people thought of them than with being real. From my family, though no one would have said it, I learned that the truth was often a liability, and that at the very least, certain things, like one's accomplishments, really ought to be exaggerated, while others, like one's fears, feelings, and failures, were best minimized, if not omitted entirely. But by the time I got to college, I realized that the people I most respected and enjoyed were all essentially honest. Someone asked them what happened, and even if it made them look silly or underprepared or ignorant, they narrated the facts. Someone asked them how they felt, and they described their emotional state. Someone asked them if they wanted to do something, and they said yes if they did, and no if they didn't. I found this odd at first, unsettling, but eventually incredibly compelling. These people were not perfect, far from it, but they were not ashamed of their imperfections, which is another way of saying they were not afraid or ashamed of being human. So in my early 20s, I took up honesty as a spiritual discipline. I wouldn't have been able to quote the first letter of John then. Let us love, not in word and speech, but in truth and action. But I realized with just some simple observation, painfully, slowly, that my capacity to love and know God and others, and to be loved and known by God and others in return, was impoverished when I was not really committed to speaking my truth. People don't talk much about the discipline of our virtues, at least on a practical level. So here's what I actually did. Every night, I committed to looking back on the day that had passed, and if I hadn't acted or spoken with integrity, or had exaggerated or minimized something in the interest of making myself look better, I told on myself the next day. I asked a core group of friends and family I trusted if they would help hold me accountable, forgive my awkwardness, which was great, and encourage me. And slowly, being a more honest and open person became easier and easier, and I began to feel something I'd never felt before, a certain kind of wholeness and freedom, like my skin fit, like people actually knew me, like I knew myself. And then other things shifted. My actions became more easily aligned with my values. My capacity to recognize the truth of others became more refined. And perhaps most surprising, I became more forgiving, more compassionate, especially for those who were not safe, secure, or supported enough to give this kind of practice a try. We tend to think of moral exemplars, Mother Teresa, Gandhi, the saints, Jesus, as really far off and refined, perfect in an almost inhuman way. In today's gospel, for example, Jesus says, "I am the good shepherd who lays down his life for the sheep." He is perfectly known by God and known perfectly in turn. It seems so lofty, so intense, a love that calls for such a radical giving away of the self. As Christians, we talk a lot about following Jesus, but the sacrifice and commitment of these kinds of declarations can be intimidating, even discouraging. I can't help but wonder, though, if Jesus didn't take baby steps from Mary and Joseph's living room to becoming the Good Shepherd, if he wasn't like all of us, faced with an infinite number of choices, moment by moment, day by day, year by year, that prepared him slowly, painfully, for such self-giving love, if he didn't stumble into his fate and his future to some extent, just like all of us. Perhaps this is precisely what it means to love in truth and action, to be transformed on the way into the one God created us to be, to let our love flow from the deep well of love that is God. This makes sense to me not only because of my own experience, but because of some fascinating research on the opposite of honesty, lying. I recently heard an interview with Dan Ariely, a professor of psychology and behavioral economics at Duke University, and the author of The Honest Truth About Dishonesty. I see some of you might have seen it as well. In his research on dishonesty, he spent time with notorious criminals to understand how they ended up where they did, noting that most people think of robbers, drug dealers, and murderers as fundamentally different kind of people. But he found that, troublingly, this is not always the case. He offers an instructive example of a middle-aged man who was a former professional cyclist. As the result of an injury and some life changes, he had to take a break from cycling for a while. But when things calmed down, he was eager to return. He started training on his own and then reconnected with his old team, going out for his first group ride in months. It was pretty embarrassing. Having been one of the stronger performers on his team beforehand, he struggled to keep up with his friends and was extremely frustrated by the end of the ride. Seeing his distress and wanting to help, one of his friends gave him the name of a doctor, whom he went to see a few days later. The doctor prescribed a medication that increased the production of red blood cells in his body. It had been developed for cancer patients, but had become popular with athletes. After all, more red blood cells means more oxygen, which means better performance. The man filled the prescription at his local pharmacy and began taking it as prescribed. He saw dramatic improvements in his cycling and soon returned to competing. He didn't think of himself as cheating. After all, he got the medicine from his regular doctor, and both the visits and the pills had been covered by his insurance. A year or so later, though, he was troubled to learn that the drug was being banned in the US. Many of his teammates, who also took it, began talking about other ways to get it. The man eventually found a supplier in China and started importing the drug for his use. His friends asked him to get some for them, so he increased his order, and soon other cyclists in the area had put in their requests. Within a few months, he was providing medication for dozens, and then hundreds of others. At this point, he is, technically, a drug dealer, smuggling a banned substance across international borders and supplying a large network of users, which is precisely what landed him in prison not long after. But it started with such a justifiable few steps. Ariely points out, deception can be a slippery slope. In fact, almost none of us are actually perfectly honest, and those first little steps are surprisingly easy. For example, nearly everyone is capable of justifying small infractions, stretching the rules just a little. there's a window of a few miles over the speed limit within which we don't really feel like we're speeding. There's a tiny margin of error when completing our taxes, within which we don't worry too much about the perfect accuracy of the numbers. As Michelle Alexander, author of The New Jim Crow, says nearly every time she speaks, we are all criminals. It is, in fact, our unwillingness to admit and acknowledge our propensity for falsehood that can keep us stuck in it and make us so dramatically willing to other those criminals who get caught. As a behavioral economist, though, Ariely is not so concerned with the question, why do we lie, but with the question, why don't we lie more? The answer, if there is one, is complex, but it seems to come down to our being social creatures. Our society celebrates the virtue of honesty, and that seeps in, and so we genuinely want to think of ourselves this way, a people of truth and action. And because we evolved to need one another, and honesty correlates with dependability, it's an appealing consideration in the flourishing of our relationships and communities. So though deception can be a slippery slope, honesty is too. And if we're willing to give it a try, to really make a concerted commitment to this practice, we might find ourselves stumbling into a fate and a future that is more genuine, more generous, and more generative than we would have imagined. It's important to remember this in an age of false news and alternative facts. It's important to remember that as people of faith, we not only believe in truth, but in a capital T truth, a truth that grounds reality, around which our lives and the universe are ultimately oriented. There's a truism popular in some idealistic communities that goes something like this. Dying for something is easy. It's living for something that's hard. With the Easter story so recently behind us, it's easy to hear Jesus saying that he lays down his life for the sheep as code for his willingness to die for humanity, a shorthand for the cross. But today's gospel doesn't actually say that. Jesus never says he dies for the sheep. Instead, he says simply that he lays down his life for us. He offers it. He lets go freely and lavishly because he loves us. For Jesus, this did eventually mean dying for the well-being, safety, and flourishing of humanity. But first, it meant living for them. And incredibly, it continues to mean living for us, not in word and speech only, but in truth and action. I wonder where we would have found the Good Shepherd last Friday, as thousands of young, vulnerable students walked out of their classrooms to protest the rampant gun violence ravaging our society, endangering our children and our neighbors. I wonder where we would find the Good Shepherd in the ongoing waves of disclosures of sexual violence and harassment that continue to rock our communities. I wonder where we would find the Good Shepherd in this era of mass incarceration, opioid addiction, religious extremism, environmental change, and refugee displacement. Don't look only to the cross or the tomb. You won't find him there. Look where people are laying down their lives for the vulnerable, the oppressed, for the sheep in need of a shepherd, where people are freely choosing to love lavishly, sacrificially, radically, allowing the needs of others to impinge on their comfort and status. Look where people are loving in truth and action, stumbling into a fate and a future that is not of our own making, word by word, moment by moment, choice by choice. And then turn your focus inward to the voice of the one who calls us each by name, saying still, "Come and follow." Amen.